The Turbo 400, also known as the Turbo Hydromatic 400, TH400, and THM 400, was the first heavy-duty automatic mass-produced transmission made for large passenger vehicles and heavy-duty pickup trucks. When the General wanted to put a transmission in a hot rod, a motorhome, a land yacht, a 4x4, or a 1-ton pickup, the Turbo 400 was used without question for a period spanning about 30 years. Even though GM stopped putting them in trucks about after 1991 or so, there's still countless Turbo 400s being maintained in the military in their Humvees. And aftermarket companies are still making custom Turbo 400s for the racing and hot rod industry. And today, 30 years after GM stopped using the Turbo 400, it's still the go-to transmission for bracket racers, street rods, and hardcore off-road builds. There's several reasons for this. First of all, the Turbo 400 is strong. It's much stronger than most of the transmissions made today. Secondly, it's super simple, requiring no electronics or complicated parts, and it's a no-brainer for a standalone transmission with a manual valve body in it. And lastly, it's physically smaller and much lighter than modern heavy-duty transmissions like the 4L80E. So it's really easy to package into tight spaces like a rock buggy, and it doesn't add a lot of weight to the vehicle. So now that we know the Turbo 400 is the ultimate transmission for a rock crawler, let me give you some tips that'll make living with your Turbo 400 easier. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about torque converters. I decided to tackle the subject first because it's probably the most misunderstood aspect of rock crawling, in my opinion. The first thing you need to know is to totally and absolutely disregard what drag racers, trophy trucks, Ultra 4 cars, and rock bouncers run. What rock crawlers like us require is something vastly different out of a torque converter. As rock crawlers, we basically have two big requirements when it comes to torque converters. First of all, it must favor low RPM rock crawling. And secondly, it must run as cool as possible while we're on the trail crawling. This means that rock crawlers need to stay away from high stall converters. A stock type, low stall converter will give you more control in the rocks, and it'll help your transmission run a lot cooler. Also be mindful that you can't go by the manufacturer's generic stall ratings for any converter. Factors such as your camshaft, engine horsepower, gearing, and tire size can quickly make those ratings totally unusable. The more torque you have, the more stall you'll have for any given torque converter. It's best to call a company like Hughes, give them your build specs, and make sure you tell them that your build is for low-speed rock crawling. Your goal should be to have enough stall that you don't drive through your manual brakes in 4-low, yet low enough engagement to crawl effortlessly and keep your transmission temps down while you're on the trail. Having too low stall is actually better for rock crawlers than having too high of a stall. Behind me, my 383 powered buggy is running a GM20 2000 stall Hughes torque converter, and I honestly feel that I could have gone with a lower stall torque converter in that and been happy. And next, you have to think about keeping your transmission cool. And right off the bat, I'm going to tell you, don't scrimp and get one of these cheap heat sink coolers to cool your transmission. Don't do that. Heat is the #1 enemy of a transmission. 2 ways to keep your Turbo 400 cool is to add a good cooler and to run more fluid in the system. So don't run one of those little inline heat sink coolers like you might do for power steering. Use a real radiator style cooler. No, I run the biggest damn transmission cooler I can fit and still make sure air flows through it while I'm slowly crawling on the trail. And that moves us on to the second way to keep your transmission cool: fluid capacity. You should be running a deep transmission pan that lets you run an extra quart or two in it. Also, running a full-size torque converter instead of one of those little mini converters will give you more capacity and keep your torque converter cooler while you're on the trail crawling. And it goes without saying that the bigger your transmission cooler itself is, the more capacity you're going to have in the system by default. And now it's important to keep your transmission fluid clean. Contaminants is the #2 enemy of your Turbo 400. The factory configuration for the breather on the Turbo 400 is very, very inadequate for keeping contaminants out of an off-road transmission. You should be running a breather hose up high with some type of filter on the end of it. Dust and sand out in the desert will work its way into every hole if you don't have some type of filtering device for your breather hose. Also, make sure that your dipstick is sealing all the way and not letting contaminants down into the dipstick tube. So you need to keep the dirt out of your transmission. And lastly, it goes without saying, change your transmission filter regularly. Contaminants will naturally form inside your transmission from normal clutch wear and friction between parts. Even though you don't get as many miles on your rock crawler as a street-driven car will, you do use it much harder. So in my opinion, it's a good idea to take the transmission pan off, change the filter, and give everything a good inspection at least once every few years. And another point I want to bring up on these filters is when you're changing them out, it's really easy to lose this filter spacer. I've serviced dozens of Turbo 400 transmissions that when I took them apart to change the filter, this little spacer was missing. And the problem is, when you take your pan off and you take this bolt out that holds the filter into the transmission, a lot of times people pull this filter out and they let this spacer drop into their waste oil pan, and it ends up getting dumped out with the waste oil. So don't lose this spacer. And just in case you have a transmission that doesn't have the spacer on it, I put a link down in the description below to a new AC Delco one of these. And the way this works is this bolt goes through the bottom, spacer goes on top of the bolt. And that's how that's set up. And it goes without saying that when you take your pan off, clean it up really nicely. And most steel and even aluminum ones will have a magnet in it somewhere. Clean this magnet off really good. That's picking up all of the shavings from normal wear and tear. So the metal's not circulating through your system again and tearing up pumps and everything. So make sure you clean this magnet off and put it in. If you don't have a magnet in your setup, you need one. And now we're going to talk about transmission fluid. Out of every chapter in this video, the one on transmission fluid is probably going to be the most divisive and controversial. If you ask 50 different transmission shops and builders about fluid, you'll likely get about a dozen answers. So with over 30 years of experience running Turbo 400s in everything from hot rods to 4x4 rigs to tow rigs to rock buggies, I'm going to give you my opinion on fluid. Basically, these are your viable options. You have good, better, great, and the best. The GM Type 3 fluid is what GM wants you to put in their TH400s. You know, it's made for smooth shifting in a daily driver vehicle, and for that purpose, it works fantastic and it's cheap. But in my opinion, this stuff isn't made for extremely hard abuse. It was developed to make shifting seem smoother through the use of friction modifiers. The Type F fluid, though, the Ford Type F fluid, is better than the GM Dextron 3 if you're running a transmission really hard while racing or off-roading. It doesn't contain all those friction modifiers that cause slippage in the clutches. So Type F fluid will give you more positive clutch engagement and provide less slippage. A lot of very reputable Turbo 400 builders recommend Type F transmission fluid. And next, we move up to the synthetic fluids. The advantage with the synthetic fluids here is resistance to thermal breakdown, which is what destroys otherwise clean fluid and can completely destroy the fluid's additive package. These synthetic fluids give you an added level of protection, but they do it at an increased price also. The guy who rebuilt my Turbo 400 about 10 years ago highly recommended Mobil 1 for use in his transmissions. And lastly, we move on to what many consider to be the best fluids. Every time I go to the pits at a desert racing event, probably I'd say 75-80% of the vehicles are using AMSOIL. I hear testimonials all the time from racers who claim that they can't keep a transmission alive without AMSOIL. Others claim that their transmissions run noticeably cooler with AMSOIL compared to other brands, but I can't confirm anything like that. Is AMSOIL just hype? I don't know, but there's a lot of guys standing on the podium who use it. But honestly, your average rock crawler isn't a racer or overly concerned with things like thermal breakdown. So given the price of this, a compromise might be in order. You need to remember that those deep transmission pans and those big transmission coolers cause us to have a huge fluid capacity, and that can get really expensive with synthetic fluid fast. So you might also have to consider what's within your price range. But whatever you do, stay away from modern GM transmission fluids like Dextron 6. As these fluids are just way, way too thin for the old Turbo 400. And now I'm going to talk about dealing with leaks with the Turbo 400. The one problem with the Turbo 400, as far as leaks go, that most rock crawlers have to fight is a leaking dipstick tube seal down at the transmission. Our rock crawlers are constantly being banged and slammed on rocks, rolled or flopped, and vibrated like crazy on nasty washboard roads. You know, and those little dipstick tube seals just don't stand a chance against that. The older dipstick tubes used a little O-ring seal, and those would always rot out, and they didn't handle heat very well. So those failed pretty fast, in my opinion. Then after it was painfully obvious that that little O-ring seal wasn't the right fix for sealing up that dipstick tube, GM went to a little grommet seal. It kind of looked like a little hat. And those seals did work a little bit better than the older O-ring seals, but those eventually get stretched out and lose their seals too, especially from all the banging and clinking and rolling that rock buggies do. Well, and you could see right here, this is one of those hat style grommet seals for the dipstick, and you can see it's when I pulled it out, it's cracked, and look at it, was even coming apart in there. So yeah, for an off-road rig that gets slammed around a lot, these factory grommets for the Turbo 400 aren't that great. Well, there is a permanent solution. The low-car anchor-tight dipstick tube. Actually, this thing actually bolts to the inside of the transmission pan, so it can't come loose. This is literally the only thing I've ever used on a Turbo 400 in a rock crawler that didn't leak. Also, unlike other low-car dipsticks, the anchor-tight ones have a big enough opening to use a standard funnel to pour fluid in. And one of the things I really like about these low-car anchor-tight dipsticks is that it's locked in there. You're not going to get any dirt on there. You're not going to get any leaking out of the dipstick tube. It's locked, especially in a rock crawler where, you know, you're on your side a lot and at extreme angles and everything. You know, the factory dipstick tube, when you're at an extreme angle, it might start leaking tranny fluid out the tube, but these are locked tight until you unlock them and pull the dipstick out. So this is a locking dipstick. Pretty slick. Another seal that leaks, especially on dedicated rock buggy builds, is the speedometer gear housing. You know, most rock buggies are running without the factory speedometer. I'd say 99% of buggies out there are running without the factory speedometer. So what you can do if that's leaking a lot is you could simply pull out the leaking speedometer gear assembly and plug up the hole with the freeze plug. Some companies out there make a really fancy billet aluminum speedometer plug, but those have seals on them, and those rubber seals on those always seem to leak, just like the speedometer gear you pulled did. In my opinion, the cheapest and best solution is to just install one of these 1 15/16 inch freeze plugs. This is the Dorman part number 555-040. And I have links to all these parts in this video down in the description below. And that brings us to the last source of leaks, the pan gasket. I really don't like those old cork gaskets at all. And even some of the rubber ones, it's a really soft rubber that ends up swelling and rotting and leaking later on. So I've had a love-hate relationship with a lot of different Turbo 400 transmission pan seals. But I'll admit it that the Moroso one is the best. You know, the best investment you can make on a Turbo 400 for your transmission pan is to put one of these Moroso pan gaskets in it. They have like a metal piece in the middle encapsulated by a rubber that's just the right firmness, I think. So I highly recommend these gaskets for you. I want to thank you for watching my video on tips for using the Turbo 400 in a rock crawler. I really hope to see you all at Trail Hero in a couple weeks, and if you can't make it, I'm surely going to make an awesome video after the event, so expect a Trail Hero video this year too, like you get every year. Well, as always, thank you for watching, and keep the rubber side down.